Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today's session covering the Southwest and the implications of the white paper as it's being worked through. And of course, the main headline of that is the new standard method. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first of DLP's webinars this year, covering a range of practical planning themes. As many of you know, DLP operate out of a number of offices, including Bristol, London, Bedford, Milton Keynes, Nottingham, Rugby and Sheffield. We undertake a wide variety of work, but including housing need and employment need assessments for local authorities, as well as participating in a large number of development plans in terms of promoting development sites through the planning system, as well as doing appeals. So we're relatively well versed now in the new virtual reality world of doing presentations and indeed giving evidence and being cross-examined under conditions such as these. Today, we should be running for about an hour with about 40 minutes for presentations, and then we are going to take questions. The people presenting today will be Meghan Rossiter from DLP Planning in Bristol, our Bristol office, Alid Barcroft from the Strategic Planning Research Unit, also based in Bristol, and indeed myself. During today's presentation, if you've got any questions, please use the question and answer function at the bottom of your screens, and we'll monitor these throughout, and we'll either deal with them during the presentation, or we'll actually deal with them at the end of the presentation, depending on how it fits in. If anyone's connection fails during the session, just rejoin using the same link for the session. That should work for you. We will circulate both the presentation and a list of key takeaway points following the webinar. So that will include any answers to the questions that we get that we can't deal with within the time. Now, it's been more than 6 months since our last webinar focused on the Southwest, and that was planning for the future. And that's when we're looking at what the white paper was saying, and in particular, what the impacts might be in terms of the standard method, the new standard method. That became known as, and if we have the next slide, I couldn't resist this, being a man of a certain age, the mutant algorithm. Now, as we know, the standard method was not an algorithm. It was some fairly simple maths, which was probably the critique of it. But that aside, calling it an algorithm, a mutant algorithm, is a little bit like calling a pigeon a turtle. Hence the slide. It's ironic in that the standard method is actually trying to increase housing for teenagers as they grow up, so they can have the same opportunities as many of us had in terms of accessing the type of housing they want. At the time, we highlighted a number of issues with the method, including the operation of step 4, which required the government to step in and moderate the results of step 3 to take into account constraints in the Greenbelt. That's something that was completely ignored by tabloids and the Shire counties, and resulted in they're revolting, if you like, against the methodology. So it was a very difficult thing for the government to do, step 4. So we've got a different step 4 now, which Alid will take forward. Other changes in the white paper are much more wide-ranging. We actually know that inspectors have now been seconded to the Ministry of Housing and local government in order to assist with the changes, and we expect a government response to the consultation that was undertaken, and we all responded to sometime in the spring, i.e. before the middle of the year. In terms of where we're going with this presentation, Alid will take you through the new standard method and what it means for the Southwest. Meghan will look a little bit more detail at the thorny issue of planning around Bristol, as well as the wider implications of the housing delivery test, which were published recently. I'm going to look at some of the other measures in the framework in terms of 5-year land supply, and look at those together with the issue of the standard method and past delivery and past delivery of local plans to have a wider range over the southwest to see, if you like, where these issues are coming to the forefront in terms of plan making. We've decided not to deal with the Natural England advice regarding the Somerset levels and moors and the Moors Ramsar site. That does affect Mendip, Somerset West and Taunton and South Somerset. But we do know that both the councils and the Home Builders Federation are working hard to, if you like, resolve that issue. So what I'd like to do now is hand over to Aled Barcroft just to talk about the new standard method and what it means, if you like, for the Southwest. So Aled, over to you, my friend.
Thanks, Roland. Aled Barcroft here. For those who don't know me, I'm in the SPRU team, the Strategic Planning and Research Unit, and I'm based out of Bristol. And I'm just going to give you a quick run through of the new standard method and what it means for the Southwest. Good news is it's fairly simple. There's the old standard method as set out above the step 1 to 3, setting the baseline, still based on the 2014 based household projections. Then there's the affordability, which is still based on the latest affordability ratios. And then there's the capping, which is still based on the same methodology at 40% or the local plan target. And then there's a new step 4, which is the cities and urban centres uplift, which is a 35 uplift applied to authorities in the top 20 cities and urban centres list, as based on ONS's latest, which is the 2019 list, based on the top urban centres by population. So if we can have a look at that, the list is as follows. There's your list down to, that's the top 82, because that was what fitted on the page. The important ones are the top 20 in the box at the left, and Bristol is in at number 4, which seems slightly high to me. Having been to, I think, all of those in the top 20, I think Manchester, for example, feels like it's bigger than Bristol. But anyway, this is based on ONS's urban centres, and it's similar, but it's not the same as local authority boundaries, which is convenient, but also slightly confusing. It's convenient in that most urban centres have a local authority, which is broadly the same and has the same name. So that's the authority that gets the uplift. So that's convenient for most of them, but it's confusing because there's obviously some that don't, or some where the local authority has the centre in, but also covers a massive area of countryside or something, where that also includes a load of villages or rural population. So it doesn't quite align. So you end up with some slightly janky geography, and those areas get the uplift, and it doesn't quite make sense. So Manchester, for example, has Manchester itself, but then you've got Salford, Bolton, Rochdale, Stockport. I think probably most of those are on the list as well. And so they're not included because they're included separately, whereas Bristol includes Bristol and probably parts of South Gloss, parts of North Somerset, but they're all included as Bristol. So it's roughly right. That's fine for somewhere like Bristol, which would be in the top 20, whichever way you slice it, and which local authority is going to get the uplift. It's going to be Bristol City Council. Plymouth, similarly, whichever way you slice it, it's going to be Plymouth. Is going to be the authority that's got the bulk of the population for Plymouth urban area. The interesting one, the edge case, is BCP, Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, where you can see Bournemouth comes in at 24, just outside the top 20. However, if we were judging it by BCP, Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, you add in Poole and Christchurch. There's a kind of sliver, so it is a slightly separate area, but Poole and Bournemouth definitely are kind of agglomerated. That I make that 8th or 9th in the list. So if you do count that as a combined area, then that should be in the top 20. And now that BCP are a single authority, there is definitely an argument that should be combined. So that top 20, to my mind, should include BCP now that is a reorganised authority. Interestingly, in PPG, the link to the urban centres list links you to a 2015 list, which predates the reorganisation of Dorset. So it appears that it's just based on an old list. However, when I discuss BCP in a little while, the whole standard method for Dorset is based on a lot of old, out of date, and it's a bit all over the place. So oh, what's gone on there? Sorry, can we just hop back? So yeah, the other thing, that BCP issue notwithstanding, the top 20 is actually pretty locked in. There is small up and down movements, maybe 1 or 2 places between areas, but generally that cut off at top 20, Brighton and Hove, they're not really in any danger of falling out. So that top 20 is pretty locked in, the BCP issue notwithstanding. Okay, so moving on. So looking at each of the individual areas. So Plymouth, they had the Plymouth and Southwest Devon local plan was adopted relatively recently, March 2019. So that remains up to date for decision taking in terms of the target there, which was based on OAN methodology, I think, which was set a target at 1335 dpa. So calculating the new standard method, which would include a 35% uplift for Plymouth, it's a little bit complicated because the local plan area doesn't quite align with the district area because of Dartmoor National Park. So PPG allows for slightly altered approaches, not quite as prescriptive for those kind of areas that include national park boundaries, but taking a similar approach, i.e. taking off the national park allocation, I've calculated the new standard method would be 1,487 dpa. So that's not what would be required at the moment. As I say, the adopted target remains the local plan target, but in 3 years, when that becomes more than 5 years old, then that new standard method, that would be the figure that they'd have to be, that would become live, as it were, they'd have to work towards. In BCP, the LHN, the local housing need, is still based on the previous local authority boundaries. So that's still calculated as Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole separately. So there's no changes to the LHN under the standard method because they're all assessed separately and none of them have the urban centres uplift. And that appears to be the case. They will continue to be calculated separately as long as the 2014 base projections continue to be used in the standard method, because the 2014 projections obviously include those separately and have not, they don't include BCP as a geography. So until they update the standard method to include updated projections, then in effect BCP is kind of locked in time with 2014 projections and old urban geography uplift. And the affordability ratios are produced at BCP level now, but you would still calculate it using the latest ones for the individual authorities, which I think is 2019. So it's their standard method literally won't change until there's a completely new methodology now. So that's literally locked in time. Okay, and then next we can look at the west of England. So Bristol's LHN they do get affected by this urban cities uplift, because at the moment the standard method is very much the live figure for them. So their local housing need increases from 236 dwelling per annum up to 3196 dwelling per annum. Baines and South Gloss remains unchanged. So that gives the west of England, that's the WECA combined area, 5256 dwellings per annum. So the emerging SDS would plan over a 20-year period, would plan for that's 105,000 new dwellings over the 20-year period that it's planning for. So that's actually quite similar to the target that was in the withdrawn JSP, but obviously North Somerset are now out of the equation. So the sites that were in North Somerset are no longer alive. So they'll have to identify sites within just the 3 areas rather than the 4. And the updated PPG makes account for the areas that are covered by a strategic policy, a strategic plan. And it's up to the strategic policy making authority to decide the disaggregation of the LHN across the areas. So you would sum it up and then they can work out how that's going to be distributed. So Bristol's increase does very much affect Baines and South Gloss, but it's up to the authority to decide how that is disaggregated.
And that passes on to taking those figures that Alex talked about They're effectively set out in the first column, the indicative housing need, December 2020, taken from the government issued figures. When you look at the 3 combined authority areas, what I've done in each column here is in the first column, I set out the indicative local housing need. I then compared that, I've got the current local plan. I've then got the average delivery over the last 3 years, which we know from the housing delivery test. And then I look at the change from the current local plan and the change from the current rate of delivery. And when you look at this, if you like, across the West of England authorities, you clearly see the issue rests fairly and squarely with the City of Bristol in terms of requiring a substantive uplift in from both its current planned level of provision, but also indeed a substantial uplift from the recent rates delivery. We're using similar tables later on when we look further afield in the southwest. What you also see is North Somerset, which I put in at the bottom of the table there. Again, at present, underperforming against the indicative housing need or standard method, both in terms of what it was planning for in its plan, but also in terms of substantially under-delivering in terms of what it's actually delivering on the ground. So some key pressure points there, which Meghan will now talk about how those 3 or maybe 4 authorities are going to try and sort that particular conundrum out. Meghan.
Yes, thank you, Roland. I think at this point it's useful just to remind those of us who are not so familiar with the West of England just why they have struggled so much over the past however many years to do plan making and to do it well. And the one key percentage we put up on screen is how much of the West of England area is covered in greenbelt. What the map doesn't show is the amount of land that is also covered by area of outstanding natural beauty designations. The City of Bath, of course, is a World Heritage Site. There's a huge amount of heritage issues across the 4 authority areas. And also the flood risk areas. There's an increasing recognition across all of the authorities, particularly North Somerset and incredibly more so in Bristol, of flood risk. I know from practical experience dealing with Bristol at the moment in city centre locations that allocated sites are currently being an enormous amount of difficulty getting planning permission because of strategic flood issues, which are involving the Environment Agency. And those issues will trickle across the years as we try and take forward plan making, but also decision making. And so these are really key issues that everybody's grappling with and will continue to do so. Next slide, please. I think, Kirsten, sorry, thank you. And then, so just reflecting a little more on the former Joint Spatial Plan, which is quite amazingly wiped from the internet for our purposes. The 2 inspectors that reviewed the Joint Spatial Plan were incredibly damning in their second letter, which did it in saying that the local authorities essentially hadn't grappled with the issues of how to disaggregate need, how to share it out across the 4 local authority areas, and how to practically and robustly assess sites. So the difficulties that they had previously was in assessing how much need have we got across the area. Let's wipe out the political input for the time being, and let's think where will be sustainable, where can we deliver development best so that it improves the lives of communities across all 4 local authority areas, and drive delivery properly. And partly because the local authorities hadn't grappled with the issue of greenbelt release, that plan has failed. So then if we move on to the next slide, one of the interesting things now, as Alan and Roland have already touched on in detail, is the need has gone up. So as a result of the failure to put a plan in place previously, the West of England authorities, including North Somerset, are now faced with a situation where they've got an increase in need to plan for over the future, at the same time as having a shortfall in delivery over the last few years, partly as a result of not having a plan in place. Bristol's having to deliver the 35% uplift. And so the question I know on planners' lips and on an awful lot of developers' lips at the moment is, what's going to happen? What will the authorities do to review the Greenbelt and to be consistent? And how are the local authorities going to have to deal with the fallout from the white paper changes? Now, some of the commentary that we've seen on the white paper suggests that it's going to take so long to filter through the zoning, for example, through to local plan, that we just have to pull up our socks, get on with it, and deal with what we've got now. And I applaud that. The local authorities do have to do so. So yeah, if we move on to the next slide, the 4 local authorities in the West of England are making some good progress, and all are making very good noises about working together and driving forward their own local plans. Bath and North East Somerset are doing a local plan update, so they're not doing a new local plan. They're doing a partial update looking at some additional delivery to deal with supply. They're grappling with some of the climate change policies that are coming through in development management issues at the moment, and dealing with the city centre problems of having too many students and dealing with houses of multiple occupation. But for the other authorities, it's a case of getting on with new local plans. Now, sitting above those is the combined authority, which has to do a spatial development strategy, and that is part of the development plan. So that has to, as Alad's already said, that has to deliver the growth figure for the area for those 3 authorities, and that has to define that within the next few years. So their timetable for that is to take it through a draft plan later this year, and then to deliver an examination next year with eventual, not quite adoption, but in 2023. Now, that plan will not allocate sites, and this is the problem that we had with the joint spatial plan previously, which tried to fudge the issue by allocating strategic development locations. I'm not quite sure how the spatial development strategy is going to broach that issue. But what it will do is it will define the growth number for Bath, Bristol and South Gloucestershire. And then below that, each of those authorities, together with North Somerset, have to bring about their local plans, and all delivering on the new housing numbers. So what we know is that in September last year, the latest statement of common ground was signed and published by the 4 local authority areas, saying that they're all going to collaborate, they're all going to work together. If we move on to the next slide, and they're all going to try and do what they can to bring about the change that is needed. One of the really important matters that the standard method does grapple with is affordability. That was another real serious issue with the joint spatial plan. There wasn't enough uplift to deal with the huge amount of affordable housing needed across the 4 local authority areas. We are still in a situation of housing crisis. Not enough affordable housing gets delivered in any of the local authority areas. And so what will be interesting is seeing how the SDS deals with that and how that disaggregates down to the 4 local authority areas. Now, of course, because this statement of common ground was signed in 2020, that was prior to the new standard method being brought in. So we have a huge question mark at the moment as to how the local authorities are going to deal with this new number, the new uplift in Bristol, and how they're going to share that out. All the right noises are being made at the moment. All of the local authorities have had lots of briefings going on recently, saying that we're all working together, we need your views, and lots of consultations have happened and will continue this year. But what we need is more action, more allocations, and a speeding up of delivery, because no one's delivering enough at the moment. And on that note, if we move on to the next slide, last week or the week before, we've had the release of the housing delivery test results for 2020, and this was earlier than perhaps expected, given the previous 2 years' results were released in February. What's interesting about the latest housing delivery test results, other than the results themselves, is that this was the final year of transition from the new NPPF period. So whilst the previous 2 years, the baseline had been set very low, we now have a threshold of 75%. And if your delivery is below 75% of supply over the past 3 years, then the presumption in favour of sustainable development kicks in. So we can see very nicely on this map here that Bristol fell for the first time below that presumption threshold at 72%. We've got Dorset authorities falling into the danger zone. And so what this means in theory is that for those local authority areas, the presumption kicks in, and we should be seeing an uplift in the number of approvals in those areas. Of course,
if I may, Meghan, sorry, you mentioned the Dorset authorities. They are all still being assessed separately for the housing delivery test, which is because of the thorny issue of East Dorset and Christchurch not being able to be, they've got a joint local plan and they can't disaggregate their joint housing need figures. So identifying the HDT figure for them, sorry, their local plan was adopted in 2014, so their figure is still live until 2019. So any HDT figures that still rely on the 2019 figure will still have to be separate. So basically the HDT up until I think 2022 will still have all the Dorset authorities separate. So from 2022 onwards, they should be from the new reorganised authority boundaries, unless they adopt a local plan in advance of that.
The wonderful world of planning and all of its many caveats. And this is
we'll come to the chances of them adopting a plan later.
I thought I'd better put that in, but it's slim.
Yeah, of course, one of the difficulties with the housing delivery test is, whilst in theory the presumptions kicked in, if you're looking at sites that are in a footnote 6 area, as in if it's in a green belt or an AONB or other, that presumption is disapplied automatically. So you're still in the territory of having to prove very special circumstances or otherwise, and demonstrating that the need for that development is very, very strong to overcome this this application of the presumption. So it's a nice result. It's about time that some local authorities started falling within that territory of having to apply a buffer and having the presumption. But it's not enough of a kicker to force planning permissions on some sites.
And taking that through, obviously the other side of the coin, the housing delivery test is about what has happened. The 5-year land supply is about what might happen, i.e. projecting forward in terms of both future need and future delivery. And an interesting point that Meghan's already raised actually comes through on this. These are the sites that have recently been found not to have a 5-year land supply on appeal. So in theory, the tilted balance is applied. However, if you go to the next slide, where I've actually put the details of the recent appeals down, what we can see, none of these are actually particularly big sites, to be honest. However, what you can see is for the ones where there have been, if like, a failure of the 5-year land supply, the majority of them are actually being dismissed rather than allowed, which does beg the question exactly how tilted is the tilted balance. But a lot of it does come back to the other planning policies and whether or not you're having an impact on AONB or Greenbelt or other footnote 6 policies. So I think Gladman actually have done some wider research which looked at how decisions went where there was supposedly a tilted balance in place, and found that in effect more were lost than gained permission on appeal. One of the reasons for that might be, if one steps back from it and looks at housing delivery tests as well, is the difficulty of areas which are highly constrained to actually find reasonable sites to release, so that even at appeal, even when tested at appeal, those sites still remain, if like, in policy or other terms, difficult or constrained to deliver. But what I'm now going to do is spend a little bit of time just running through the rest of the areas of the southwest. And I'm using if we go to the next slide, what I'm using is I'm using the same approach that we've started to use, which is looking at what's required from the new standard method, comparing that, if you like, to whether or not it's an increase or decrease from the current local plan, and whether it's an increase or decrease from recent levels of delivery. So looking at Wiltshire and Gloucestershire, the two standout authorities are probably Forest of Dean and Stroud, both of which now have a standard method requirement above that's in their last local plan and above that from what they've been delivering. So if we just go and have a quick look at how they might be delivering. First point, of course, is to recognise that in this area, there is, of course, although you have Swindon in Wiltshire, as you get further north towards Gloucester, you do have the AOANB, which makes both making allocations and indeed achieving planning permission on unallocated sites a lot more challenging. If we have the next slide, we go to the Forest of Dean. Forest of Dean, third options are out for consultation till tomorrow. So if you've got any sites in the Forest of Dean, please have please get busy with writing those reps in. Of course, engagement in the local planning system, even when one might suggest that it's not working particularly well, is absolutely vital, both for developers and house builders and land promoters, but also I think it's important for local authorities to be fully aware, if you like, of the opinions and constraints that developers have and house builders have in trying to deliver sites. In terms of Forest of Dean, they're looking to accommodate about 4,000 units. They're going down the classic line of looking at large strategic allocations. The point one makes generally on that is the timescale of those going through. If you look at Bleachley Camp, MOD is still there, I believe, so it's a case of waiting for them to vacate. So there are long lead-in times for those type of developments. So to make that plan sound, one would actually probably need other sites, smaller sites, more deliverable sites, to actually fill in, if you like, the time between the plan adoption and, if you like, the delivery of strategic sites. If we move on, we can look at Stroud. Again, facing the same problem. It's gone back out to consultation in terms of looking to accommodate the higher standard method, looking at between 1,000 and 2,400 homes, and giving a wider range of options about how to do that. Intensification, high densities within the existing urban areas. I'm always a little cautious of that, because urban areas are made up not just of buildings, but also of the open spaces and the spaces between buildings. And intensification can, I think, take away the character of areas. Option B, further development out to the smaller towns and villages, if you like, spreading the net a little wider for sites. Option C goes with a growth point, an individual growth point. Again, you have a lead-in time problem with those type of solutions. And option D is to cast the net very wide and looking to small villages, as tier 4 villages. In reality, you probably need a version of all of those. A strategic site's always worthwhile to give you a backbone of supply, but actually allocations across all settlements actually deal with need, if you like, where it occurs. and including affordable housing. So there's some interesting opportunities potentially there. If one moves on to look at Somerset, now obviously there are issues in Somerset, as well. I highlighted at the top of the webinar in terms of the Ramsar site. But if you look at where there needs to be an increase from local plan levels and delivery, it's Mendip and Sedgemoor. And looking at what those are suggesting at the moment, if we roll back to the next slide, we see Mendip's at examination of part 2 as we speak, I believe, in terms of its local plan. However, a year ago, the Cabinet did confirm that it was going to review the plan, and it needs to in order to keep it up to date. And it's looking at revising and testing the local need. That will be against the revised standard method, and looking, if you like, at where growth might be located. So very early days, if you like, for Mendip, but one of the cumbersome points about the plan making system is, yes, here we are, examination of part 2 of a plan where part 1 was adopted some time ago. And really the planning policy requirement and everything has moved on from this. So one of the questions I think we'd ask you as an audience to assist us with is, what are the major kind of hurdles in terms of actually getting development plans through the system at the moment? And why are we ending up, if you like, chasing our tail all the time? In terms of Sedgemoor, again, Sedgemoor is commencing work, if you like, on the new plan. Had a plan adopted in about this time 2 years ago, so that's got 3 years left to run before it starts falling to be out of date. It did have the classic main modification, which is early review. Sometimes I probably unfairly think that's code for this isn't a very good plan, do better next time. But as I say, that's probably an unfair comment. It's just some of the ones I've been at examination with, that seems to be the get out of jail free card. Turning further to two areas that Alan's already talked about, which is Bournemouth, Christchurch, Poole and Dorset. Again, areas where there seems to be possibly quite an uplift from recent rates of delivery and local plan preparation or figures. Looking at Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, they were out in 2018 as a call for sites. The regulation 18 issues and options was meant to be out last year but wasn't. What you can see from the plan put underneath, that is not their plan, that is a result of their call for sites, which I think is quite a good thing for local authorities to do. People can see what's being promoted. Couple of interesting points on that. The light brown or orange areas are SUEs being promoted for housing and mixed use development. The darker brown is housing sites, and the dark green are SANGs being promoted, which I think is a useful response to what we are going to need to do in terms of dealing with, if you like, the impact of development, and in particularly recreational requirements for development. Going on to Dorset, Dorset's interesting in that they appear on their own work to think that they have a supply of probably 9,000 dwellings over and above what they need as a whole. And that includes some 16,500 units on existing allocations that have yet to be consented. And the plan next to them, you can't see it very well at this level, but if you get the slides afterwards, you'll be able to see where those are located. And if you like, those are housing and employment sites located across the county. Moving on, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. You've got a number of, if like, interesting things happening. First one is Cambridge and Greater Exeter. You'll see if you move on to the next slide. If you move on to the next slide, that's the area we're talking about. Part one of the plan was subject to consultation last year. Sites for new homes are going to be consulted as part of the Greater Exeter strategic plan. So, and the Cambridge local plan part two. So Cambridge, if you like, did a consultation on something that didn't deal with the elephant in the room, which is the housing and employment allocations, but consulted on other issues. Of course, the decision by East Devon District Council to withdraw from the Greater Exeter strategic plan, and by Mid Devon District Council to commit to prepare a revised joint plan, has really put this all into a bit of a disarray. So the sites and options consultation, which was due to take place in September 2020, didn't take place. So if you like, a breakdown of the planning system there. Moving on, the last and possibly not least, Tor Bay. Tor Bay is a strange location, I think. It hasn't done much in terms of forward planning, it would seem, for a number of years. The last local development scheme was 2017, and that identified April 2019 as the start of the 5-year review. If you look at its 5-year land supply, it boasts a 2.77 years of supply. And interestingly, in the land supply document, it talks about the neighbourhood plans for 3 of the areas, as if you like, as if that's a make weight or a substitute for actually having a fully made development plan. And it does actually talk about the conversations and correspondence it's had with various MPs, etc., which seem to me to suggest that it isn't looking very seriously at plan making, but relying more, if you like, on the process of neighbourhood plan making. Now, that's a quick roundup of where we are. If we can just go back to slide 5, which I kind of skipped over quite quickly, but we've got a number of questions coming in, but just in terms of some other questions I think I'd put to you as an audience. One of which would be, what one thing would you change to achieve a greater delivery of housing in the Southwest? You know, and that will be individual, if you like, to your own circumstances, probably. The second point is one I've mentioned already, which is what do you think is the largest hurdle in achieving an up-to-date local plan coverage in the current system, if you like, in terms of the planning in the Southwest? And lastly, because it is an emerging issue, especially with some of the authorities in the Southwest, is does claiming a climate emergency mean no or less development? What are the implications of a climate emergency in terms of delivering housing for the population? So if you could have some responses on that. And the first thing, we have got a number of questions coming in. First one is, how can local authorities predict housing delivery that might arise from changes to permitted development use class orders? And that, how do they account for this when calculating housing need? I think I'll ask, I might deal with the first part of that at least. There's several things. One, housing that's come forward through permitted development rights is being monitored by most local authorities. and that is being counted towards, if you like, the known supply and deliverable supply. Most authorities count them as if they were full permission, so it's category A rather than category B sites in terms of the framework's definition of deliverable. So there's that. In terms of how used in calculating need, the bottom line is you don't, because that's the provision of housing through prior notification or changes to use class order doesn't affect the overall need that's being generated. It affects the supply. The question could be is, can you project that supply into the future as you might do windfalls, and say it's, if you like, a large site windfall? I think there are difficulties with that because it really depends upon the level and appetite for that type of conversion within the different areas. So that's that. The next question we've got is the challenge that meeting standard method and continued greenbelt and the lack of potential challenge on 5-year land supply. The white paper does potentially remove the challenge on 5-year land supply grounds and does continue to support the greenbelt. So I think to begin with, Meghan, do you want to just have a go at what that means for the Southwest? I mean, in some ways you've touched on it already in terms of where the tilted balance is already being applied, but
yeah, of course. So the greenbelt protections, they're not going anywhere anywhere fast right now, are they? The white paper's essentially nodding towards greater protectionism of the greenbelt. In particular, AONB isn't going anywhere fast, but greenbelt, we know that politically it remains, and it will likely remain, the hot potato touchstone for local communities, politicians, etc. It's not going to go anywhere, but then we have to look at places like the west of England, as they're going to have to grapple with it in the short term. They're going to have to do greenbelt review in order to come anywhere near to meeting the scale of need that they're going to have to deliver on in the next 20 years. Now, the local authorities briefings that I've seen over the last few months have tried to indicate that they will obviously do their best to intensify in the urban areas and to deliver out towards the villages. But as those of us who were involved in the JSP have seen, local communities are so mobilised by what's already happened and what they can see coming over the horizon that it's not easy to shed out the need out to the villages, however much there may be a need for growth in those areas. So I can see some slippage in greenbelt areas in and around the urban areas in the coming years. Inability to challenge on 5-year housing land supply grounds, as you showed in the slides earlier, Roland, having the lack of a 5-year housing land supply already doesn't give you a guarantee of getting a permission. Can't see that changing substantially over the coming years. I think if housing land supply disappears as an argument, we're left in even more of a quandary as planners as to how to obtain permission in difficult areas.
Yeah, so I think the current standard method, whereby they've just, if you like, redirected a lot of the housing demand or the housing requirement to meet 300,000, rather than being in the shires, which is where the demand is. That's why the calculation worked that way, was to put more development where the demand was. By putting it back in, if you like, to the top 20 urban areas, most of which are tightly constrained either by their own boundaries or by greenbelt, is, if you like, relatively self-defeating. I mean, these aren't areas, as we know with Bristol, they're not areas that have tried not to intensify there and bring forward brownfield sites. They've been trying very hard to make the most of the brownfield that they've got. One thing that did come out, which didn't come out in the question, but I think it rolled into it. The white paper also talks about doing away with the duty to cooperate. I think, Alid, I'll ask you a little bit about that. How do you think that's going to affect, if you like, in terms of achieving, if you like, development around, well, around Bristol for starters, but also in other areas? In some ways, it's overrun by unitary authorities, but in others, there's still potential for the duty to be quite an important factor, isn't there?
Yeah, it's this issue that, as you highlight, that it's focusing development in the urban centres and prevents the overspill into the surrounding areas, which, yeah, as you say, is how realistic is that at delivering additional housing? To my mind, it remains to be seen. I think it maybe plays into the first question that we had, which is maybe hopeful, but the uplift might implicitly answer that, in terms of there's going to be a lot of office space in those urban centres that, given the situation with COVID, I think the expectation is there'll be a lot of vacancies, and in an ideal world, maybe we translate those into residential and that answers itself. And so this 35% uplift neatly addresses that, and that's the supply solution in those urban locations. I think, is there any evidence? I've not seen any evidence to support that happening. It's massively early days, and you could argue it's just a convenient time to do the urban centres uplift to take advantage of the change in working practices due to COVID, if you want to be very cynical about the change in standard methodology at this moment. But you could argue that that was the kind of implicit way that, you know, delivery could be increased, and that's why you do focus it in the urban centres, that other areas maybe couldn't quite deliver that level of uplift.
Just on that, in some areas where we actually have feedback from, if you like, what demand is rather than what need is, i.e. what people want rather than, you know, demand as in where they're expressing the type of dwelling they wish to live in, as opposed to, if you like, a need assessment, which is based on the number of people in the household. Do you think there is a genuinely ongoing large-scale demand for apartments across the southwest, or are people, you know, are people looking for a wider variety of housing types?
Are you saying the difference in what people can afford and what people need? Is that the distinction here? Yeah.
Yes, I'm saying to a certain extent, you know, are we providing people? Are we meeting demand, or are we meeting need? Those being two different things.
The argument is that there's been a change in lifestyle, that people don't necessarily. It's not necessarily affordability pressures that are changing the type of dwelling that people want to reside in, the type of tenure. For example, more people want to live in the private rented sector because of the lifestyle offer, or people want to live city centre living, for example, and that necessitates living in a flat rather than living in a 3-bed house. I think there's definitely an argument there. There is evidence to suggest that there is, you know, urban living is an increasing phenomena, and that is lifestyle choice rather than affordability. But affordability pressures, you know, the evidence is clear that is also driving that, and that's another factor driving household formation rates, especially in the younger age groups. So I think it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B.
Almost a politician's answer there. Well, Meghan, I think you've got your name down to answer the next question, which is the climate emergency.
Yeah, we've had a question about, or it's more of a comment really, the climate emergency and how this is going to, we're entering a serious period of adjustment. I know the new building regulations, Part L, came out very recently and is pushing for an even higher reduction in household emissions by improving the fabric efficiency of each dwelling. And local authorities up and down the southwest and across the country are pushing for ever more improved efficiencies and use of energy from renewable sources. And massive implications for build costs. I saw that some commentary on the Part L changes suggest a significant uplift in build cost to meet that change in requirements. And yes, I think the comment that it will affect affordable housing delivery on sites is accurate. We've seen it previously. It's nothing new. You push up build cost expectations, and it's got to push down somewhere. And of course, the problem we've got across a lot of local authorities now is a lot of them have adopted community infrastructure levy, and that's static. That's not going to go anywhere. So how do you reduce your costs? You reduce the amount of affordable housing you're producing on each site, and that will affect the affordable housing providers up and down the country. MMC will have to come more on stream more and more as we go on, but I am conscious that we're close to the end of our time, and maybe we want to capture the last comment that we've had, a further comment we've had about
yeah, I think we'll do that. Just on that, I think we can overrun by 5 or 10 minutes. People can sign off if they need to. I think with the comments on build costs, one of the ideas, well, not the ideas, but one of the approaches I think we can't let go is that the fact that in terms of the cost of housing, cost of land is still one of the largest costs, and that's driven, if you like, by scarcity. And one could argue that if there was a greater supply of land, then people would actually be making the choice about whether they paid maybe just a little bit more or the same price for a more heat effective, environmentally friendly property. It costs less to run than they would for one that doesn't. So that differentiation could actually take place in the marketplace if the whole thing wasn't actually swallowed up by the fact that you're paying huge amounts for land in most cases. In other words, you know, when you've got 10 households chasing 9 houses, someone's always going to make a compromise. Whereas if the market is more equal, then if you like, you would see, I would think, that demand would drive better and more efficient house production. But the last,
on that, Roland, I think the other point coming out of that is that, of course, local authorities, if they want to have ever better build quality and placemaking ideals on individual sites, is they can't have their cake and eat it on all development types. So the urban edge developments or brownfield redevelopments can't achieve the same build quality or energy efficiency or renewable energy outputs that the greenfield sites can, because greenfield sites obviously have more land to play with and more capacity to put in the new infrastructure required to deliver those renewable efficiencies. So there's a circular argument there, and how do we feed that back into the plan making and the allocation decisions when we want to intensify in the urban areas, but to deliver very good placemaking, we are going to have to perhaps look more and more at the greenfield locations to give the open space and other benefits.
And another question we've had come in, which is an interesting one. It deals with the joint spatial plan around Bristol, and basically what does one do with all the work that's been done and all the evidence that's been collected supporting those allocations? Does it all just get tipped in the bin and do you start again, or could it be used for the base of a new local plan?
Well, the reality is you don't put it all in the bin as soon as it's been put to one side, do you? You don't forget about all of the knowledge you've got on each of those strategic development locations. They're still known knowns. I think what the 4 local authorities have done to date is say, right, well, we know about this site, and this site. What about the sites that you didn't tell us about previously? what's changed, and how can we use the evidence that we've already got to make a more robust, comprehensive assessment of each of those locations to meet the need that we now know we have. There's no way that they've got rid of all the evidence on all of those sites, and we've seen that on the SHLA mapping that they've already done. It'd be ludicrous to lose all of that information.
Yeah, the problem was with the structural approach. So you still use the same evidence, but just do the approach properly, and fit it in the correct order, as it were. But yeah, the evidence, the sites are still there, aren't they? So
yeah. I think the only other thing on that is that to remind anyone that's got sites anywhere across the southwest or wherever you're promoting sites, always put in the information that puts you in the best light, because it might have been a no-goer last time, but that doesn't mean it's a no-goer now.
What you're alluding to is putting a red line around a piece of land and sending it in is like one used to do with outline planning applications, is no longer the approach one needs to take.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to give the councils the confidence to allocate. They can't allocate if you're next to something that might tell them no, if actually you found a way to mitigate against whatever concern that is already. Give them the benefit of your knowledge. And
yes, not only your knowledge, but actually assist. Plan making is hard enough, so assist local authorities by providing them with the full remit of relevant reports at the scale they are needed, and that's the point. Some authorities will insist on having everything, but there is a scale, if you like, which one can take into account when promoting sites. But certainly, it's about being active. So, one last question, I think, for the two of you, is how different do you think the planning of sites around strategic sites around Bristol is going to be in the next in the next iteration of any plan that does get produced for the area?
That's not a difficult question at all. No, it's a very difficult question. How different is it going to look? I think I come at it from a hopeful position. I hope that the local authorities will grapple with Greenbelt and actually look to do some releases, rather than pushing need out, or just dropping need off a cliff. So I think the SDLs that we had before will have to be augmented and supplemented by new ones, not disappeared.
Alid?
Yeah, I think Greenbelt review, but that's easy to say, very difficult to do, as we see everywhere across the country. So I think, I was quite hopeful a few years ago that London was going to be the first to kind of get the Greenbelt review, and then there was going to be a kind of domino effect, but it hasn't yet. So I think until they bite the bullet with that, then we're still, everywhere's kind of holding tight, aren't they? But that's my view. It's got to burst at some point, hasn't it?
I think that's a true optimist speaking there. If we think we're going to sort London out, but true. It should lead by example, shouldn't it, as a capital city? My two pennies, I think, is that yes, you might see a number of the major sites still come forward, but let's get a range of sites in there which can deliver, if you like, over the whole plan period. Not all your eggs in one basket in terms of strategic allocations. You do need a good, if you like, selection of sites across the area, and that's good. It's good for everyone, and it's good for the economy. It allows different people and different actors to be involved in the process of delivering housing, both in terms of market housing and affordable housing. So that's my two pennies. We've run over a little bit, but I think it was worth it in order to deal with the questions. Thank you all of those who've attended and those who've asked questions. If you have any questions that occur to you after we finish, please email them to us. You have our contact details. We will be providing you with both a copy of the presentation and, if you like, a a short list of key takeaway points from, if like, the panel on, if like, planning in the southwest and the impact of the new standard method. So thank you, Meghan, and thank you, Alid, and that's goodbye from us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.